Hello, beautiful community. Tell me if you can hear me okay, and we're going to get going. Very, very welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much if you've also watched my 17-minute commentary on what happened today over Moscow, which is ever we need to put into the context of um, what care is really about for us at the moment, and that is, of course, what's happening in Ukraine, which has been a victim of Russia's brutal invasion now for a long time, a victim of Russia's genocidal rhetoric, a victim of Russia's terroristic attacks. Hello and greetings, everybody. Hi, Andreas. So let me just say something brief that's very important. And that's about Moscow. So I, as a child, lived in the Soviet Union. And during the 1980s, the Soviet Union was in a state of decrepitude. And at that point, the country was on the verge of significant food shortages. But they made sure that certain things like bread and butter were available in the big capitals. So, where am I going with this? I'm going toward the idea that, in a way, Moscow, Petersburg too, but Moscow especially, is a country inside a country. As Max Katz correctly said earlier today, it's like an abroad inside Russia. And so the degree to which it's important for the Kremlin to isolate Moscow from this war that they're conducting can't be underestimated. And therefore, even a symbolic attack on Moscow has enormous political and psychological advantages for Ukraine. Let's take a few questions that were dropped here while people were waiting, and then I'm going to be happy to catch up with the chat and see what you're asking then. Pure Tones asking, Vlad, you seem to be suggesting that no moral judgment can be made on the drone attacks in Moscow. If so, can you clarify? If not, how does one evaluate the ethics of it? So let's see if I messed up. Let's see what I said on Twitter and read in that video. I said that several Russian anti-war commentators said it's never a good idea when cities are attacked, and equally many Western commentators have said that the attack is ethical. Both views are an ethical misunderstanding of war. The drone attacks on Moscow are neither good nor bad, they're real. They are real because you don't get to bomb and terrorize a country for 15 months and expect this doesn't come back to you. Any moral assessment of Ukraine's drone attack on Moscow as morally proportionate or disproportionate is an ethical misunderstanding of war. Ukraine is not an impartial, dematerialized court, but an innocent victim of a brutal invasion fighting a defensive and existential war. So, two things. Obviously, I am saying something that needs much more differentiation, but that would take us to the philosophy channel now, and we don't want to go there. So let me just make two general points about this. Number one, I'm worried about the primacy of moral judgment when it comes to working out how we react to different things that go on in a war. And the issue here is that there are many things that have positive or negative value whose negative or positive value is not moral. For example, the works of Beethoven, right, are important for their aesthetic value. Our conversation right now is important only very indirectly because of its moral value. I'm not trying to get us all to become morally better. I am trying to get us to make sense of the world better and maybe be more reassured in the way we orientate ourselves and freer in the way we look, right? But there is a specific, this is the first observation, there is a second observation, which is that there is a specific moral value that I want to deprioritize here, and that is the value of justice. When Ukraine launches drones at Russian territory, they are not driven by the value of justice. They're driven by other values, right? And some of them are only ambiguously moral or not moral at all. The primary values for Ukraine in launching these drones on Moscow, if that's indeed what's happened, which is our overwhelming presupposition, um, is that's about not justice, but values like national survival, like keeping one's culture, like enduring as a political entity, right? So let's take a very quick example just to round off this point. That's nothing to do with the war. Imagine that we've caught somebody called Ricky, and that Ricky has special information about a terrorist attack on a big Western population center. But it's only if we torture Ricky that the information is going to come out. Now, this makes terrible presumptions about the practical efficacy of torture that are probably false. But for the hypothetical nature of the example, let's stick with it. Now, it would not be quite right to ask the question, is it just or unjust to torture poor Ricky? It's more, is it okay to torture Ricky or not on the balance of all of the factors and considerations available? Which means that it's not about justice, right? It's about necessity, or at least other values like saving a whole bunch of civilians. So therefore, the point here isn't that we've got to make sure that it's just to torture Ricky if we're going to torture Ricky. The point is that the value of justice recedes into the background and other considerations become primary. Don't stretch the value of justice to such an extent that it, in your conception, becomes meaningless. I can say much more on the philosophy channel. For now, we're going to stick with that observation. Very quickly, Thomas Leith is asking about the outsourcing of politics. That's for another time. Relative time works. Is it me, or did Russia just indirectly admit that the attacks on Kiev are terrorism by declaring that the drone attacks on Moscow are terrorism? I actually don't draw an equivalence between Ukraine's drone attacks on Moscow and Russia's attacks on Ukraine, because at the moment, the end goal of Ukraine is to create a drama for people living in Moscow. The end goal is not to kill Muscovites. That could change, right? In future attacks, that could change. But it's not so with this one, although admittedly that could have been a byproduct of it. But the Russians are actually trying to kill Ukrainians. So there's a difference. That's my only comment for the moment. Relative time works. Epistemic is asking, when the Kremlin's accusing Ukraine of terrorism in its public statements, who is it hoping to let that opinion affect? The key target for the Kremlin in its statements today are Muscovites. And what they want is to dissolve any sense of alarm. That's it. They're trying to play this down. And when they talk about terrorism, their intention is to say, well, there's a bit of rogue activity going on, but it's nothing like a war. Don't worry about it too much. That is the primary aspiration. James, good to have you. And you're asking, Vlad, I agree Ukraine will increasingly attack inside Russia, but will they go as far as the weapons that they're given by the West and using them on Russian territory? So there are two issues. The West has some limitations of what Ukraine should do on Russian territory from the West's point of view, with whatever weapons, Western weapons or not. And then it has even more coercive and particular expectations of what Ukraine can do with Western weapons on Russian territory, which is a bit, but really not much at all. Now, What Ukraine will do is push these expectations to the limit and make the West uncomfortable and beyond uncomfortable in the next few months, with the aspiration to stop just short of creating, for example, a democratic crisis for Western leaders, whereby they have populations that are questioning in ways that these political representatives can't answer why Western weapons are being used on Russian territory. So this is a balance Ukraine will try to strike by pushing the West to the very limit of discomfort. Geddes, thank you so much. Let's see where we are at. Ole is saying, good health to you and thank you. Love back. And you don't have a question. Alexei is saying, Vlad, can the attack on Rublovka, which was the target today, provoke a change in behavior in the regime's elites, such as affecting their loyalty? No. Since you didn't comment on it, I surmise your answer is no. Yeah, I mean, I suppose some people in the elites could say, oh, could I have like some protection for my special house outside of Moscow in case it's damaged by a drone? But at the moment, the regime's position is, yes, Ukraine can hit Moscow, but it can hit Moscow with these relatively harmless drones. So this is something that we're going to swallow. We're going to tell the population to shut up and that nothing much is going on, and hopefully they'll stay depoliticized. Yes, we do want to politicize them, but our massive war against the West is not going to come until 2028, let's say. So they want the population depoliticized, not particularly alarmed by this, and they themselves are not very alarmed by this. I mean, Mr. Putin's calm statement is not theater. He is confident that the Russian population will not wake up from these kind of attacks, and he is confident that at the moment, Ukraine does not have reach to launch anything significant at Moscow. If and when that changes, they're going to start thinking about this differently. The problem that's created, however, here for Mr. Putin is that this let us not be alarmed disposition is enormously offensive to the Z radicals. So this is the strategic victory of this, as far as I know, for the moment, casualty-free attack on Moscow, that it has created a deeper problem for Mr. Putin in his relationship with the Z radicals. They are not okay with Mr. Putin's reaction. Nothing is happening, and this is all under control, and this is a little bit of rogue activity we shouldn't pay attention to. So that answer works for most of the population, but it does not work for the Z radicals. It creates a bigger rift. And what do we think? We think that in 2023, the single biggest oppositional force to Putin inside the country are going to be the Z radicals. So this dramatizes tension inside Russia's political landscape. And that Ukraine believes is to its advantage. Richard, thank you very much. CS79N, provocative opinion, poorly articulated. No, I don't see. Are you talking about the attacks on the terror attack on London? The point of this attack was psychological impact. The point of this attack was not to kill people by Ukraine. We don't want to miss the point here. Ukraine is in a defensive and existential war, and it will do anything it feels it can on Russian territory that it can get away with. And Ukraine is specifically interested in unpredictability now. Ukraine is interested in bringing about a situation where, for instance, Russia might do something left field. If Russia used non-conventional weapons in Ukraine, that would be massively to Ukraine's advantage. Ukraine would benefit from that now. If Ukraine's counteroffensive yields modest results, the key leverage for Ukraine will be these kinds of attacks on Russian territory. And the provocation of various kinds of reactions that escalate the war, consolidate Western support for Ukraine, right? Um, but so far, what we have seen has been uh, today, at least, has not been aimed at killing Russian civilians. Let us see where we are at. Alex, I hope I have said enough about the moral qualification. I would ask you to think beyond justice here in particular, um, beyond good and evil, as Nietzsche might say. Michael, great question about how Ukraine will balance this business of attacking Russian territory with keeping the West on board. I've had a sort of initial go at it, but it's something that Ukrainians will be very keen to be um, I would say bold about. They're going to push it right to the edge and more, because Ukraine is facing a very serious situation. Yes, there is absolutely no prospect in the short term of Kiev falling, but there's a real prospect of the war freezing if Ukraine's counteroffensive does not yield phenomenal results. And that is a kind of catastrophe for Ukraine's security, a real catastrophe. This is really existential, and anything Ukraine can do to shift the situation from the scenario of a frozen over war, it will try it. And that includes risking great displeasure in Western capitals. Leslie is talking about Matthias Rust, who we mentioned in one of the videos on the main channel, who landed little plane on Red Square in the 80s. I do think that the Kremlin is comfortable that they're better prepared to defend against more serious weapons and against these low-flying drones that can get through very easily. So at the moment, they're saying, yes, we can't stop this much, but we're not going to incur that much damage, and we're confident we can keep our population sufficiently depoliticized. So, great to have everybody here. And let us have a look what more questions we have. Pool is saying, Vlad, surely Ukrainians understand Russia deeply, and they know that attacking Moscow in such a mild way with no casualties will have no effect. No, it has an effect. It has an effect. If you're talking about the full Monty effect of dramatically politicizing the Russian population, well, that's nearly impossible and would take a lot. But this has a dramatic effect and would be considered by Ukraine as a very successful venture within the limits of what Ukraine can do. If Ukraine had more to launch at Moscow, it would. And if it when it does, it will. So Zazu is saying that Konstantin on Inside Russia talked about how the local neighborhood chat in the three building complex, which was hit today, quickly veered to many neighbors advising to keep photos and videos quiet and wait for the evening news. One lawmaker in Russia suggested that you um, should be criminally penalized for taking footage of drones. We'll see how this goes, of course, because um, these events will become more and more dramatic over time. This is not. This is overwhelmingly unlikely to be the most significant attack on Moscow. Nicola is saying, I'm glad to see this attack by Ukraine. What I'm recommending always is a rich economy of moral sentiment so that your thinking is not gamified. And there's a huge risk of gamification, kind of moral gamification of your thought. I want you to have an ambiguous, somewhat contradictory economy of ethical sentiment, right? That's a result of your own exploration. I don't want to prescribe how that goes for you. What I'm warning about at the moment is don't over ethicize that economy, right? If you think something is a good thing, don't necessarily go on to think that it's a just thing and it's good because it's just. Um, so I'm saying something very important here about the ethics of war when I'm recommending um, against with each single thing that occurs, giving it a primarily moral evaluation and especially a primarily moral evaluation in terms of justice. Damien, I read a suggestion that Mr. Prigozhin could be involved with drones as it embarrasses the military and further his aims for power. What do you think of his idea, of this idea? It's not a starter. If you're suggesting that Mr. Prigozhin has organized a large-scale drone attack on Moscow, it's not a starter. Mr. Prigozhin will also just not be there the week after if he did indeed do that. Um, Mordred the Strange is saying, "Have you seen NFKRZ's latest video?" No, I haven't. I sometimes, in a supportive way, watch his videos, but I haven't seen the last few. Um, I'm sorry to say that I haven't seen it. Julia, thank you so much. Let's see where we're at. Paul Curran is saying it'll be interesting to see 1420 interviews after this. They're going to be evasive. They're going to be evasive. And don't forget that the majority of Russians refuse to speak. So put 1420, remarks by passers-by through that filter, right? And indeed, some of what people are saying is potentially criminally liable if they criticize the government. So we're looking at a very small cross section there of the population and a kind of a psychodemographic, which we cannot generalize. Arthur Ray, who is doing a phenomenal job with his channel, he's an extremely talented YouTuber, specifically YouTuber, and YouTube is hard. He's a very talented YouTuber, and Arthur is saying, in his view, that these attacks will politicize Russians in favor of Putin, not against him. Is that not at least a risk, and if so, to what degree? What these attacks are aimed at is not to politicize Russians in favor or against Putin, it's to politicize them. And how they get politicized is a matter of political conflicts inside Russia and a matter of uncertainty. So, what Ukraine will be happy about here is, for instance, what we've just mentioned, additional conflict between the Z radicals and the regime. So all of that Ukraine is gonna welcome. Now, is flying drones over Moscow obviously going to turn people against Putin? No, no. Um, could it create the feeling, well, we could be under siege here, so let's mobilize together? Yeah, it could. Is that arguably more probable um, as a result? Yeah. But if that's more probable, it doesn't mean that this hasn't worked for Ukraine. Because it's inevitably going to shake things up to some extent. But we should not overestimate how far this goes. Now, despite the depoliticization of Russians, they will start moving in Moscow if they feel that there's a very significant danger. How will they move? They won't move politically, they'll move out. So there's going to be an exodus from Moscow of people who can afford to escape for a bit or leave if there's a serious concern about safety. That is the kind of mobilization that will happen first, which we saw with actually military mobilization. That's the mobilization that will happen first before there is political mobilization. We're nowhere near that on the basis of this. As I say, this will be at a push the first topic at dinner conversation, but maybe even not that in many households in Moscow. So, yes, probably Arthur is right that that may be the more obvious direction in which people go. It doesn't undermine what Ukraine's trying to do. It's trying to shake people up and shake up Russian politics a bit. And as I say, a key issue here for the Putin regime is that they are going harder on this image of let's not be alarmed, and the Z radicals are getting more and more provoked by that image. Dachal is saying, would Putin declare a war? And would that create a change of mindset in Russia in any particular way? Putin feels that the population is not ready for this to be properly declared a war, and he feels that that would be very dangerous. If by properly declaring it as a war, you mean coming fully clean about how much over time Putin wants to militarize the society and militarize the economy. He feels it's too early to come clean about that. And even if that's where he's aiming, he's actually going to try to not do it unless he feels that the social fabric is ready for that kind of a turn. He's hyper conservative when it comes to asking people to do things that he feels they might not be ready for. He's sometimes been reluctantly forced into this, as he was with the first mobilization. But Putin's approach to this business of political mobilization versus political apathy is, first of all, to realize how much he doesn't actually control, right? What happens. He partly does, but partly doesn't. And to constantly hit the accelerator and hit the brake pedal and hit the accelerator and hit the brake pedal, right? And over and above that, even Putin's psychological profile is not entirely compatible with where he is thinking he may be able to take the country. Putin is not a kind of Stalin profile tyrant. His preference is to remain, you know, a kind of plebiscitally selected monarch sitting atop an informational autocracy. Matthew is saying, could Ukraine do the same with Minsk? There's a key difference. The Belarusian population is, to a very good extent, politically awake. The Russian population is not politically awake. And the Belarusian population is held hostage by their regime, which is in turn held hostage by Moscow. And we need to see what happens with Lukashenko. Lynn, thank you so much. So that does not make sense. Stephen is asking, how will we know if politicization is really beginning in Russia? What will be the signs for it? I think what we're gonna, um, I think talking to Ben Hodges would not actually be a bad idea. I haven't thought about that, but I think it would be a great idea. Um, and he's very gung ho on the Ukrainian victory. Um, but he's also partly taking an activist position. He's saying, come on, let's make it happen, rather than this is what's going to happen. And it's important to keep that distinction. Um, now, Stephen, I think what we're going to see first is some kind of a crack in the regime that is going to be very palpable. What form it would take, I don't know. It may be, for example, um, two incompatible orders being given. And then the Russian military has to react, for example, to two incompatible orders that have come from above. Which one's it going to go with? So there's going to be a crack at the top at the same time as a reaction from the bottom. It's always wrong to think, is it going to come from the top? Is it going to come from the bottom? It's going to be a simultaneous process, and the one can't happen without really the other. But if you were to give something a bit of temporal priority, you would say it's going to be the crack in the regime, which will give folks the possibility to see that they can take action, which is going to be not just morally expressive, if you like, but it's actually going to be politically efficacious. In other words, that they could act toward an alternative situation that's not the Putin regime. Once there is that perception in Russia, people are going to be able to take more risk because they'll feel the risk is worth it. That perception is missing at the moment. It can progressively arise away from, independently from, a crack happening at the top, but a crack at the top is probably a vital part of the equation. Firestar is asking, is it safe to live in Moscow at the moment? I would say, given that we haven't seen casualties from this attack at the moment, I would say yes, it is. Could that change? Yes, that just depends on Ukrainian capacity. Feel free to ignore Billy saying my questions are usually forehead slappingly simple. Understanding that it's a guess, what was the conversation like inside the Kremlin for 3 to 6 hours following the drone attack? You mean this attack or the attack on the Kremlin? On the Kremlin, you had several incompatible reactions. First of all, they took time to react. Then they decided to make a drama out of it and call it an assassination attempt, which nobody in the world could possibly believe, because Putin doesn't live in the Kremlin. And everybody knows that. And then they decided to play it down and significantly demote it on the news. And that's what they're going to be doing. That's what they are doing with this as well. And all of that is all of these are typical signs. Don't prove anything beyond that, but all of these are typical signs of the Kremlin genuinely, spontaneously trying to react to something and not knowing how to do that properly. So, Damien is saying, I'm struggling to understand how they benefit Ukraine. They benefit Ukraine hugely. They create additional political conflict inside Russia, which is what we've just been talking about. And secondly, they give a perception of weakness about the Putin regime, that it's helpless to protect Moscow. That's not going to politicize the depoliticized Russian population at this stage, but it's an enormous blow, and it has a certain kind of significance. So additional conflict inside Russia, some potential to wake some people up, some potential to distract the Russian authorities, and make them fall into some form of incompetence and some form of escalation in response. As Mark Galeotti often likes to say, Putin can make rash micro decisions under pressure. So well, now you're also, of course, asking, could this be to call Russia's bluff in some way, that show that Russia doesn't have the capacity to escalate? I do think that Russia doesn't have much capacity to escalate, but Ukraine would welcome any little escalation this would generate from Russia. Would welcome Ukraine. Ukraine wants to dramatize and globalize the situation. Russia is keen to freeze it, right? Russia is in love with the story now, dogmatically in love with the story of waiting for the West to weaken, freezing the war, and then doing a second brutal invasion of Ukraine, where Ukraine will no longer have the support of the West, although Ukraine will be incomparably militarily stronger then. Darren, thank you. Damien, your question is fantastic. I didn't do full justice to it, but we'll keep coming back to it. Great question from Jason Yin, but I'm not going to take it now. You say that I could speak a bit about Serbian groups and Wagner, and the connections and the consequences for the Balkans. I'm going to skip this for today. If it's of vital significance, drop me a DM. We might get around to speaking about it anyway. CS79, and again, do Russians in general see connections between depoliticization and wars of aggression and this attack? Is there any understanding of this consequentially? Is there any understanding of causality? I think Ukraine is trying to provoke some understanding of causality in the Russian population. But do we think that all of these memes going around mocking some Russians, many Russians, for not understanding the connection, are these memes valid? And these memes basically say, we have only been brutally bombarding and invading Ukraine for 15 months. Why would Ukraine try to attack us back? I don't understand. Anyway, it's not helpful to create, bombardment of two countries just because there's bombardment of one. What have we done? I do think that these hyperbolic memes contain an element of truth, and a lot of Russians would feel, well, I didn't choose this regime. Yes, it started a war against Ukraine, but what have I got to do with it? I didn't start the war, so why am I being attacked by drones, even if the drones are looking relatively limited in what they can do? I think there is a lot of that, but Ukraine is trying to break that. We can debate the efficacy on Ukraine's terms of Ukraine's project, which is to bring the war to Russian soil and to make it feel real to Russians. But that is a key project now of the Ukrainian state. And actually, if we develop a pessimistic picture with the counteroffensive, that will only magnify as a goal of the Ukrainian state. We're going to make the war real to Russians. So this causality is something that's not properly seen, and Ukraine is trying to change that. Taba Garas is saying, analysis like you're delivering shines over plain statements in the unfortunate post-truth reality we're living in. Keep it up. Glad that people like you exist. There are a lot of people who are responsible. There are a lot of people who are handling their expertise responsibly. At the same time, it's also true that our informational environment is not constructed to reward being responsible, and that's a challenge. But the number of humans who partake in the informational environment in a responsible way is massive, and the number of experts who are doing their best to be responsible is also massive. Um, so it's important to say that we've got some significant post-truth problems, that we've got a crisis of trust in expertise and a crisis of trust in institutions. But it's also important to not say that the weeds in your garden are 7 meters tall when they're 1.5 meters tall. 1.5 meters tall is bad. And so we've got to say, how do we get them to a meter? Right? Rather than hyperventilating about them being 7 meters, which they're not yet. When this unfolds, here in Sweden, the populist right is vehemently opposed to Russia and is even leading the demands to impose further sanctions, but other European parties seem to be far more pro-Russian. So one of the myths that the Putin regime is kind of immersed in is the idea that every populist authoritarian politician in the West is going to favor them. They are broadly right. Populist authoritarians in the West tend to be more sympathetic to Russia, and some of them have informal links with figures dealing in ideas that are somehow attached to the Kremlin. I mean, if we got inside, which some journalists partially have, Mr. Dugin's inbox, we're going to see a lot of conversations with the authoritarian populists in the West. And that's been made harder by Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine, but that's still real. But let's take an example that is extremely clear cut here. The former Prime Minister of Britain, Boris Johnson, is by psychological profile an authoritarian post-truth populist, right? Fewer people were more doggedly pro-Ukraine than Boris, right? So that is a story that does not always work, Mr. Putin, I'm sorry to say. Damien is back with a clarification. My concern then would be that for a short-term disruption of leadership and morale, it scares Western powers who fear attacks on civilians and will cause, for instance, some Republican public officials to push for a settlement. Now, I'm a political philosopher. I don't want to talk about how particular political representatives in particular countries react to particular events like this drone attack too deeply. But my conviction in broad brushstrokes is that this particular attack on Moscow creates more instability in Russia than it does in the minds of Western officials who are trying to decide on the stability and longevity and deepening of their support for Ukraine. I don't think that the West is freaking out about what we've seen here. And I do think that a lot of Western officials are thinking, well, this is a perfectly understandable Ukrainian action. So I am not concerned about that at this point. I don't think this action puts Ukraine in danger of losing Western support. That is just not my assessment. So my answer here is reassuring. Billy is perhaps forwarding a question from future historian. Hey, Vlad, how do you see Russia 100 years from now, assuming that current trends continue, not just in Russia, but around the world? I think that Russia is going to experience a catastrophic imperial self-immolation, no matter how successfully Putin manages to stretch this out. And he can stretch it out far. I mean, he can even stretch it out as far as World War III. But one way or another, this self-destructive imperial enterprise ends badly for Russia, or at least badly for this imperial enterprise. How badly it ends for Ukraine and for the rest of the world, well, we need to minimize that as much as we can. Hypothetically, if Russia is to stand some chance of democratization, it has to federalize and decentralize dramatically, right? A different team in the Kremlin is not going to help. A team with democratic sensibilities in the Kremlin is not going to help. If you put a Western politician in the Kremlin today, and I don't mean a pro-Western, like a Western politician, even a moderate and responsible Western politician, they're either going to run away or they're going to turn into a tyrant within some years. So you need fundamental institutional reform and a radical decentralization and federalization. If that happens, there are democratic possibilities. If not, there aren't. Now, it's also possible that Russia breaks up as a political entity. That's more than possible. And if that's possible, that can happen along federal lines, the kind of federal lines that were made to some extent explicit in the 1990s and have since been played down by taking away of power from the regions. Or it can happen perhaps more arbitrarily and more violently. We don't know. But Russia's history is going to be tumultuous, but one way or another, this is a project of imperial self-immolation, and self-immolation of that project is one way or another what we're going to see. What I would say weirdness unfolds is that pro-democratic politicians, whether they're left-wing or centrist or conservative, politicians who are pro the checks and balances and the counter-majoritarian institutions are much more likely to take a responsible view on Russia than politicians who want to break our institutions. Now, of course, you've got to recognize that in many ways our institutions have failed people, and it's not about saying they're wonderful and that everything is as normal and that the loss of trust is just an outbreak of ignorance and disinformation. Not at all. But nevertheless, people who are deeply committed to saying, look, we're going to have elections in 2024 and in the 2030s and in the 2040s, and we're not going to lose the possibility to vote our governments out wherever we are. People who are committed to these kinds of democratic rituals and procedures are people who are more likely to take a responsible position on not indulging the Putin regime. Chris is asking, how would the Kremlin react if the Ukrainian counteroffensive goes perfectly, liberating everything there is to liberate? Look, I actually think that Ukraine's theory of change here is highly ambitious. Pushing the bounds of plausibility. I believe, and I think a few other people have a similar assessment, that Ukraine's theory of change is break the land bridge to Russian land bridge to Crimea, put Crimea in danger, thereby create an existential crisis in the Russian regime and regime change in Moscow. I believe Ukraine is, in its plan A, fighting a regime change war. So from Ukraine's point of view, its counteroffensive going perfectly means the disappearance of Mr. Putin. Now, what I would add to that is that Crimea is not like Belgorod, actually, even though one's Ukrainian territory and one's Russian territory. Crimea is going to create significant existential concerns for Putin. The prospect of losing Crimea is going to threaten Putin's regime stability, both objectively and in his own mind. So that's an important note to add. Rachel, what do you think of Liz Truss in regards to Russia and Ukraine? So Liz Truss raises a very difficult, and I'm at risk of going on a tangent here. Um, Liz Truss puts me in a difficult position as a political commentator because I do not believe, in general, that you can talk about people's neurodiversity, like autism, for example, um, without their consent and without them being aware that they've got that particular neurodiversity and them being open about the diagnosis, right? So that makes conversation about Liz Truss difficult. And a lot of people in the neurodiversity movement will tell me I can't go there. I respectfully disagree. Now I have some compassion as in this light for Liz Truss, but I'm certainly somebody who would begin to discuss Liz Truss's neurodiversity, even though she does not she is not aware of it. And of course, one of the issues with neurodiversity is that sometimes having it makes it more difficult for you to discover that you have it without the adequate support. So, and here it's about keeping two things in mind that are important. First, could Britain have a highly responsible and competent prime minister who has autism? Yep, it's possible. Now, are there some factors that mitigate against that? Yeah, of course there are. And is it true that in some cases, if you have got issues, that your neurodiversity can dramatize them? Yes, of course. Trump's neurodiversity, Trump's alleged ADHD dramatizes his narcissism, right? So this is the kind of conversation we have to have about Liz Truss. But the interaction of her neurodiversity with other significant limitations she has, in her particular case, means that she should not be anywhere near major public office, and she's not fit to be even in a ministerial position, let alone in the position of a prime minister. And she's not competent to make judgments about any key issues, whether it's security or economic policy. And one answer she gave about the use of nuclear weapons in the Q&A is an expression of this inadequacy for public office that I'm referring to. In one case, she said she'll be more than happy. She'll be very happy to use nuclear weapons under particular circumstances, when the real answer should have been, yes, we will do it if we need to, and that's going to be a very painful decision. But that's the opposite of what Liz said. So my answer is that it's that kind of very uncomfortable analysis that talking about Liz Truss takes us to. And this is not a person who should have been anywhere near major public office. Sorry to say. Franklin, if and just let me just add something else. I am enormously concerned with the rights of folks with neurodiversity. Just the other day, I submitted a letter of complaint to the BBC about making a program that discriminated against people, in my view, with neurodiversity. So, and I say that as somebody who has zero neurodiversity, but knows at close hand a lot about both autism and ADHD. Um, Franklin, if Ukraine is after regime change in Russia, why aren't they pursuing strategies of full elimination? I don't get what you mean. Oh, okay. Well, it's not easy to take out Mr. Putin. Um, and that would not necessarily meet Ukraine's requirements. What they want is for some kind of a coup or some kind of revolution from above to remove Putin. People have had enough of him, and they feel that he's putting his deranged imperialistic project is putting the country in too much risk. That's the difficulty here again, right? Because we are sitting here completely outraged by what Mr. Putin is doing. I mean, we just criticized Liz Truss. I mean, Liz Truss is a an angel compared to the kind of world historical political irresponsibility that is emanating out of the Kremlin. This is beyond political disgrace. These entities that are running that country, it is beyond political disgrace. Their levels of irresponsibility are unfathomable and indescribable. And so Ukraine is trying to make it apparent to some people around Putin that they're going to lose very badly with him, and that they need to realize that there is a less bad alternative to descending right to the bottom of the ocean with Mr. Putin. So the best way to get rid of Putin in Ukraine's mind is to take Crimea, or to dramatically endanger Crimea so that it looks like it's vulnerable. The showman is saying, "I feel as sorry for the Russians as the Ukrainians. Putin must be stopped." Damien is saying again, oh, from somebody, you're kindly reposting somebody's question. What do you think the impact of Moscow's strikes might be on opinion in the global South? There's a lot of indifference there. And many voices are against Ukraine, could become even more hostile. So I don't think this is going to make a dramatic difference. But what the Kremlin is pushing very strongly is that they're fighting a defensive anti-imperial war. Now, I believe that you challenge that narrative in two ways. Of course, just by challenging the narrative, but also by, thinking about how we incentivize countries, including economically incentivizing countries, that might support Russia in this to not do so. But I don't want to dramatize the effect of this outside of Russia, and in that sense, I think that so far Ukraine will be tactically happy about today. Thank you for maintaining this little sanctuary of reason, respect, and sanity. Love your channel. I'll be talking about other great sources about where we can follow the story about what's going on in Russia. I think there are plenty. The challenge is sometimes they are limited in English. And we'll talk about where the best English language ones are. And you're all just deeply and enormously welcome here. But of course, and I just love having you here. But of course, I'm not going to sit here saying that this is some kind of a sanctuary of reason. I think this is a sanctuary of sophistication. of engagement, but this is not a sanctuary of good intent and reason. There's plenty of good intent and reason about, in other, living rooms, in other institutions. Um, and I want to acknowledge that. Billy is saying Zelensky said that Russia will next swallow Belarus. Is he trying to get Belarus into the conflict to destabilize the region? Any form of escalation and destabilization favors Zelensky. That is not to say that the disappearance of Lukashenko and the takeover of Belarus by Russia favors Ukraine and Zelensky. It's not clear that that is the case. I think that conversation about Belarus is very healthy for Ukraine. I think Ukraine has not talked about Belarus because Ukraine cannot win this unless it wins this together with other forces on the ex-Soviet space that are opposed to this extraordinarily destructive authoritarian imperialistic project. And Belarus has a population that is enormously sympathetic to Ukraine's cause. Belarus has a population that is, to a very good extent, motivated against this authoritarian imperial project, that is to a good extent held hostage by its own regime, which is in turn held hostage by the Kremlin. Unlike Russia, Belarus can look, whatever faults we might find there, but Belarus can look to a leader that they know has been elected as the leader of their country. Russia does not have that. So the business of politicizing Belarus and the business of engaging with the Belarusian opposition, I think, is a very important activity for Ukraine. And a lot of Belarusians, a lot of opposition in Belarusia, and a lot of commentators with expertise on Belarusia have been disappointed with Ukraine not doing that more. Franklin is saying, "What if we took Putin's relatives? What if somebody took Putin's relatives hostage?" I don't think this is a constructive avenue to end this war. If you want a political philosopher's opinion on this, it's not how it works when you get to that kind of power. It's just not how it works. In other words, when you are swimming in these waters, the disappearance of your entire family, let's say if aliens knocked on Mr. Putin's door and said, we're going to actually move your whole family permanently into a different point in space. If you don't stop this, Mr. Putin wouldn't stop it. I mean, the guy thinks that he is the biological instantiation of some kind of collective will of Russian culture. This is a guy with a disturbing amount of sincerity. He doesn't, in minutiae, that Patrushev or the Kovalchuk brothers go in for conspiracy theories, but this is a guy who is convinced of a kind of world historical mission. So, that's what it's like to be with that amount of power of that type of power, and that amount of that type of power. Claudia McLeod, how is Putin's health these days? There is one investigation that is in Russian on YouTube. I think there are English subtitles, which makes a persuasive case that Putin is accompanied by various kinds of doctors and various kinds of um, oncologists um, with special uh, with specialization around the thyroid that they followed Mr. Putin. We can't deduce anything from this. We could deduce as maybe an oncological story. We can't deduce that it's serious. That's all we know. Olana, thank you so much. I may be missing some of you. We've just crossed the hour mark. I think a lot of people have been consuming a lot of print and video content. So, at the risk of exhausting people, we're going to start, I think, in a little bit just winding down. So, Zazu, thank you very much for your kind words. Yeah, I mean, there is going to be a spike in viewership, and but I didn't take advantage of it. This channel for us is a community channel. It doesn't really grow by itself. It grows via the main channel. So to take advantage of the spike, I would have needed to make a proper video with pictures on the main channel. I didn't do that. But yes, absolutely, there is a there is a spike. Now, if you're asking me in the long run, could we learn anything from YouTube analytics about some fatigue? Yeah. Yeah. There's some fatigue, but still there's a lot of um, there's enormous interest. Jordy Z, you've missed the chat, but that's okay. But again, there is a spike. If something is happening that we recognizably label the Ukrainian counteroffensive in action, then there's going to be again more attention. In the long run, and given the chance, would you feel safer living in Ukraine or the US, given the war? I can't answer that question without thinking of Ukraine first, and Ukraine second, and Ukraine third, and Ukraine fourth, and Ukraine fifth. But I'd probably feel safer in the United States than I would in the UK in the event of World War III. But I'm not concerned about that. If you want my analysis of why there's a kind of incremental excess openness to apocalypse in the Kremlin, it's just incremental, so let's not dramatize this story. There is a video on the main channel about how Putin thinks about nuclear apocalypse, and I argue that Putin is different to Soviet leaders, and then there's a kind of substance to his own apocalyptic remarks, such as, what's the point of a world if Russia isn't in it in the kind of way I want it to be? And here I say that it's Mr. Khrushchev and Mr. Brezhnev are together with Scholz and Macron psychologically a nuclear war and opposed to Putin. But that does not mean Putin wants a nuclear apocalypse. It just means that he, like us, very, very much wants to avoid it. But there are a few varies before Putin's avoidance than before ours. No, Putin has no neurodiversity. T. Price, thank you very much. Sophia, is there a grain of truth in what the global south says that the West is hypocritical? Yes, of course. I mean, an aspiration for the West going forward, if, let us say, Ukraine wins this war, would be to apply its own principles and expectations to itself more stringently than it has. So, is there a sense of Iraq, even the 1999 intervention in the former Yugoslavia, not the one earlier in Bosnia, that was very much necessary. But is there some sense that some of the West's interventions are absolutely weakening the West's position now when it talks about sovereignty? Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. And there is no chance in hell of persuading a global quote unquote community. There is no global community, but there is no chance of persuading these people unless we ourselves are a lot more consistent about adhering to our own professed expectations. Our hypocrisy is hurting us now, and it would be amazing, although unlikely, if we stopped being as hypocritical as we have been. Yeah, there is absolutely um, no doubt about that. And one of the things that follows from this is that um, Russia is not today as isolated as it seems to be. We could have more purchase if we were more consistent at bringing about um, an isolation of Russia. My first anniversary on being carb free, Christopher is saying, congratulations, left field. But if that's right for your body, phenomenal. Maybe I've missed some joke. It's possible too. Mark is saying 1.6 thousand views in 60 minutes, and that's not indicating fatigue. No, on the second channel, it's great. That is how many people watch lives. Again, there haven't been, for health reasons, because I have a disability, as many uploads on the main channel recently as I'd like. I'm going to share something I really hope very soon on the main channel. But the returning viewership on the main channel in the last few months has been 250,000. 250,000 people have come back to the main channel, having watched one thing to watch another thing. So no, 1.6 does not indicate any problem at all. Savage Junkie. If Putin decides to launch a nuclear missile, do you think someone in the chain of command will stop it? I don't want to get us too carried away into a nuclear risk conversation. The basic approach is that we shouldn't be staying awake because of nuclear risk. There is nuclear risk, but that does not mean we should buy into nuclear blackmail and accommodate Mr. Putin. You've got to keep two things in mind. Yes, there's nuclear risk, and also, yes, we have to stand up to blackmail and not indulge it. I think a provocative and brief answer to your question, Savage Junkie, is it's possible that by the time, if such a time comes, that Mr. Putin contemplates using a nuclear weapon, the chain of command will be too weak for that decision to go through. And if that's the case, that would in turn dissuade Mr. Putin from giving a command, because if he gave that command without it being realized, that would be catastrophic for him. D is talking about diet and bots. Let's wind ourselves up with let us say 3 more questions. Damien, Very grateful for your engagement today. ALS is wondering if the drone strikes could be a process of a product of an internal struggle. I've said that that's overwhelmingly unlikely, and I say that again. And somebody left a comment today on the main video that I actually, replied to, saying, "I believe it's produced by internal politics. It's neither a false flag operation nor is it done by Ukraine." And I said, I think it's possible that that's your take. I think the contributor called that their take, but I said I don't believe you. In other words, I believe it's a casual speculation, which you're entitled to, but do I believe it's a take? I don't. Why not? Because there is a 1 in 1,000 chance that it is a take, but for it to be a take, you need to understand what are these agents in Russia who could have done this? Who exactly? Some Z radical party? Well, which? Uh, you need to understand quite a bit about these parties. You need to have followed them probably for more than a few months. You need to be able to contextualize their potential actions against the landscape of Russia's political environment as it is now. This community is deeply engaged with this conflict, is deeply engaged with what's going on in Ukraine, but also to some extent with what's going on in Russia. I don't think most of us are in a position to make that kind of assessment. It requires knowing too much. So the vast majority of people who are saying, "I believe it was something in between," are speculating, but are not sharing a take because the take requires the kind of knowledge that most people don't have. You could get lucky on forming such an opinion one time and being right, but it would, we're really looking for non-accidental truth here. Alex V saying, what developments would make Putin go nuclear? So there are two kind of crude parties here. Billy, thank you so much. One says that there's just no conceivable scenario under which Putin would go nuclear. I think their position is under-supported. What I would say is that as Crimea becomes more imminently vulnerable, if it becomes imminently vulnerable, nuclear risk would escalate. But it absolutely does not mean that Putin will use nuclear weapons, nor does it follow that it's likely that Putin will use nuclear weapons. But it follows that nuclear risk should be taken by us as escalating if Crimea is imminently vulnerable. That's how I'd put it. Nancy, thank you so much. We're going to go one last question. I'm going to leave you beautiful people alone. Last question from Richard. How can Putin end and save his face? I believe he believes he can't, and I believe he might be right. So that is why I don't think it's likely or even possible for Putin to stop if we give him a frozen conflict now and some kind of a ceasefire. I believe that Putin's own conception of regime security, as well as Putin's sense of mission, means that unless he is defeated, he isn't going to stop. It means that unless he is stopped, he isn't going to stop. And that has enormous consequences for how we think about supporting Ukraine, actually, because there is still a part of thought in Western capitals that somehow this can resolve by itself and somehow we can magically circle back to Feb 2022. I don't think there is any way back. And I don't think this regime has, that Putin regime has a route back. And I certainly don't think um, Mr. Putin thinks that he has a route back. Mr. Putin thinks that over time, his best approach is to take Russia toward a militarization of society, a set of additional totalitarian turns, whether he's comfortable with them or not, and some kind of a vast confrontation with the West to the maximum of Russia's capacity, allowing that Russia's capacity might not allow Russia much, but he still hopes it will. So I think we do not negotiate with Mr. Putin. I think he thinks there is no way back for him. And I think we should think that there is no way back for him too. And that is why Mr. Putin needs to be defeated. And that has consequences, not just for how we support Ukraine today, but how we understand the sustenance of our support for Ukraine, whatever happens at the end of Ukraine's counteroffensive. That is as activist as I'm going to get. Beautiful community. And on this note, I'm going to say goodbye. Lots and lots of love and talk very soon. It's been a pleasure to have you all with me. Take really good care. Take care, 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 take care. Bye, 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 bye. Lots of love. Denise, bye. Damien, bye. Everybody's so rapid here. Ferrari guy, bye. Johan, bye. Jessica, bye. Barbara, bye. Everybody, goodbye.